This is Saturday afternoon, March the 4th, 1979. Hans, Will, and George are starting to make a review, a historical review of the work on our communications system research. Hans, we would like to start in now by asking you if you would please go back, turn back your pages of history, and take your time in briefing Will and me on the early work on Mark-1.
Well, the dates is what I'm trying to recall now. I'm not familiar with I've lost the exact dates. We had a record we kept on a log of Mark-1. I don't have it with me, but anyway, it must have been 1973, early 1973.
Yeah.
Earlier than that, actually, when Paul was more or less put in contact with me through a combination of circumstances which later turned out to be more than just coincidence, through a course we were both taken in which we met, in which I started doing a few translations for Paul, after which he more or less got me in touch with with more of altered states of consciousness by reading all of the books, Dr. Week's famous book, 30 Years Among the Dead, etc., and got me interested in it, and he then decided that we will both be working on a project which would try to avoid what we thought wrong approaches to spiritual voices reproduced on magnetic tape, such as the diode methods, white noise, pink noise methods, radio station carriers, all of which had one great disadvantage, namely background noise that all but drowned out the voices. There was another approach, which was the famous microphone method, which produced voices in a whisper, very faint voices. We didn't think that would lead to anything. However, one approach most promising seemed to be the approach of providing a controlled carrier, and a carrier that would allow that we would offer to be modulated in such a way that hopefully some voices would come across. What we didn't know, we were at the time thinking of a carrier that was as clean as possible as we could make it, with little distortions in the modulation and harmonic distortion, and also one that would be as stable as we could possibly make it. We acquired a oscillator, general radio UHF signal generator in the range of 30 to 300 megahertz, which was, however, not crystal controlled. We built a rather large, totally shielded Faraday cage, in size as large as possible, and we mounted it on a enclosure, connected it with the proper cables through the generator. The generator had 50 ohm termination, and was a little limited in output. The output of the generator was no more than
probably 1 volt.
Can't find a figure. It was less than 1 volt.
Yeah, there's 2/10 to 5/10
right.
is the most common.
And some of the things, some of the reports on those experiments, I'm sure the figures are on there. And we used the frequency as close, I think it was 240 megahertz. And we tried this during several sessions. Dr. Schwann described to us the difficulty of finding the carrier as looking for a needle in a haystack. But he did find the carrier, but first comments were that it is simply too weak. Too weak, and that it had a considerable drift. This was the first time it was pointed out to us or brought to our minds, even though Dr. Schwann did not emphasize that. But we began to realize how accurate the spirit frequencies are that are being utilized on our collaborators when he described the drifting of our 240 megahertz carrier. That I believe that this is a thing important to keep in mind, their ability to control these impingements precisely, to even crystal controlled equipment, that they are as accurate as any crystal control equipment that we have. Because he described the variations of the signal generator to us, and sure enough, when we measured with the meter and later on checked that the variations were just that. That's remarkable. I never put that down in paper, this is why I mention it here. We realized the need for a more stable and oscillator of higher power, and Paul decided that we would have to build something to house this because of the difficulties here again with the total shielding required. Going to a higher power level would require even better shielding. And it was, I believe, at this point that George, where you entered into the picture, or was it before that?
Let me ask you one.
Well, it was before that.
It was before that.
I
It was
remember
Mark-1.
Paul and I discussing on a Saturday morning on the phone spending the money to buy the signal generators you were talking about.
Oh, then you pay, I saw Paul paid for that.
No.
I built a very fancy, beautiful cabinet for this thing.
Going back, how did you...
No, I was in initially with Paul and made a decision.
That's right, you were there right from the beginning.
Yeah, because Paul came up to meet me in the Engineers Club in New York towards the end of 71 or beginning of 72, just to discuss, we discussed for the very first time the possibility of setting up a research on a communication system.
Mm-hmm. I didn't realize you had contact that early.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How did you arrive at 240 megacycles being the frequency?
Because somehow the load conditions of the antenna gave us the biggest signal at that point. Don't ask me why.
In other words,
it was a matter of standing waves and length of antenna. It worked out for 240 being just about giving us the best coupling and the highest output.
In other words, it was just a matter of...
Yeah, of cut and try, of trying out with the entire range of the...
Right. Okay.
Yeah. We had, I had built two preamplifiers for this, where we had microphone mixing, of course, and the antenna output, and the ability to put up to 6 or 8 headphones on there to do headphone listening, and while we were talking to the medium at the same time. So we had total flexibility on that. But the next step then was to construct, to obtain an oscillator, the Mark-2 oscillator, which gave us the stability, which gave us the higher power, and to built the chamber, which turned out to be which was the biggest problem, really, was the chamber. We paid a lot of attention to the shielding, and I must say that Paul's experience from his government standard research into high microwaves and frequencies as that were invaluable there. We could use that, the shielding we have here, as a guide for any work we would do in the future that would require higher frequencies like that, because I don't think there is anything commercially available that would shield as well as that. The thing to do, the perfect chamber would have been an egg. The egg shape would have been perfect shape, and just recently I talked to a man who said, well, why didn't you tell me? I know just a place who would have been able to build from copper or any material a perfect egg and do a beautiful job of soldering that would have given you the totally enclosed chamber in an egg shape, where the antennas and the foci would have been at the proper point, and you would have had a better relationship, a phase relationship would have been preserved better that way. The perfect phase relationship theoretically would be to have a one focal point, not an antenna that is that long as we have now, but a focal point source of emanations and a point source of reception, and have the enclosure in a perfect ellipsis, in a perfect oval, so that the distances and reflections always would be in phase. But this was a compromise, to have the oval in the laterally only, and then have a equidistance on top and bottom.
Well, in this one here, you're working on a plane because you got your antenna set up vertical polarized on both of them. So the amount of horizontal polarization, probably you can get by with it here.
Well, it was a compromise, but as it turned out, it was very sensitive at one point. I don't know how it is now, to even the slightest indentation and pressure, because of the reflections being affected by that. But the first contact and the first sitting was one of the most successful ones. The first two sittings was Mark-2, where really we made quite headway. I also want to mention that the sense of expectedness and expectation on my part and Paul's part, I know about my part, that our urgency to get this working was so strong that somehow transmitted and strongly influenced the group we worked with, where I believe that this is something we shouldn't overlook in any kind of contact and experiments we do in the future. We should have, it is the mind, the frame of mind that we have in whatever we are doing has more influence on the success of it sometimes possibly than a lot of the instruments we build. I've come to that conclusion because we noticed that the entire energies in the room at the time during the experiments were just maximum for the kind of thing we were doing. It had a great deal to do with the failure or success. I mean, the fact that we got anything at all, I believe, is probably due to that. So I just want to emphasize that, because that is something that is not written down anywhere, and it was an observation of mine a long time ago.
I believe this, and I think about the question on cost, so to clear up confusion. You're right that Paul had a checking account, and he wrote checks for things like that. But all the money that was put in that account came from me.
I was not aware of that.
Yeah.
I thought Paul had put this, was the original Mark-1 project was Paul's idea.
And it went into that Paul Jones account. I gave him completely free hand to pay the rent and everything else, but it all came out of that check.
Right. And I believe we can safely say what we've learned from these early experiments, that all impingements we received were impingements these impingements were done with if we consider two types of spiritual energy, we were then working with the kind of energy as manifest in one case during the telephone conversation that was interrupted through these energies. I believe, and I'm personally am convinced that these energies were involved in our early Mark-1 and Mark-2 impingements. There is a log existing. I don't have it with me on Mark-1, by the way. It has a day-to-day log. Also on Mark-2. I still have that. If you want it, I'll send it to you.
Your file here.
All right.
I don't know whether this is possible to answer this question.
I want to go further on the impingements and get more into the technical point of it.
Well, all right. But no, this is a pertinent question at the moment. I want to know these energies you're talking about now. Is it your opinion, do they bear any relationships at all to the energy that Dr. Nick was probably using in his experiment?
No, I wouldn't say that. No,
one's
definitely
one's
not.
Like let's say,
it's a pure energy manifestation, such as setting off, pinning your pen on the things, or causing strong deflections, or energy that's even physically felt.
that could be like those big long charges that we had on the spirit presence detector.
I mean, I believe we can almost assume that now with some degree of assurance that we really have, at least we know, two, and that energy can be manifested in many ways and can be even physical.
It could be like a bolt of lightning versus turning a flashlight on or having control of it. One is
and it can be quite strong if they want it to be so. Now, you know, being familiar with microwave transmission and telephone systems, you know it must take quite a bit of energy to influence a conversation and disrupt the carrier in such a way.
It depends on where he disrupts it. In other words,
if we know that, then...
Yeah, well, this is one of the questions I asked him one time. I said, did you do it between the two antennas? Because they're only working with...
into the micro...
well, they're, let's say, radiating 1 watt or 2 watts of... Because they're using klystrons. They don't use high power. They use klystron. But to modulate the klystron only takes milliwatts of power. And now we go back. Did he get inside? And I tried to find this out.
Yeah, but it takes milliwatts of electromagnetic energy as we know it. But it takes, but the so-called, I'm using the term elliptic energy that I'm talking about, how, if it manifests in the physical, see, there is a process of that energy will not manifest as they themselves can use it, strongly use it to its full effect. We don't see the full effect of it. We see only the transferred energy transformed into our physical manifestation. Here again.
But here again, I'm going back, and I asked him specifically one time down here. We talked about it with Swan.
I remember that question. Yeah.
And I said, did they do it out in space, or did they do it in the equipment, or did they do it on the telephone line where it come in and goes out?
You never got a clear answer.
No answer.
Right. Well, I have asked questions like that before and never got a clear answer to it.
Because the same thing, if you look at the power that goes into a tape recorder head is relatively large compared to the energy going into the microphone or coming out of the microphone. And yet, I suspect anyway, that it's not in the tape head itself, but further back in one of the preamps or one of the amplifiers.
Right. Amplification must be, there is a certain amount of amplification for it to be registered on a tape, and there must be, this is why I think even in the spirit photography there must be an energy that is strong enough to cause this haloid emulsion to register anything, and it must be concentrated in such a way, in a meaningful way, to register an image, or to compose an audible sentence on a tape, whether running or not. I mean, all of these. Well, anyway.
Throw in just a little humorous relief at this point. You're talking about they're manipulating all of these energies. In a phone conversation with Bentoff the other night, and incidentally, Hans just recently read and greatly enjoyed Stalking the Wild Pendulum, so he's getting acquainted with Bentoff.
I enjoy that book. I can truthfully say I really enjoyed it. You would enjoy that because it's right.
I read it.
He read it a long time ago.
And then I went up and talked to him for a while.
And he went up to his home in Boston to talk to him. But I was on the phone the other night and talking to Ben. He said I was talking about the process of clairaudience, and he said, "Look, George, just make up your mind. The spooks can do anything they want to."
It's about boils it down to.
That's right. The spooks can do anything.
Any lengthy conversation on that, it boils down to that. They can just about accomplish anything if they.
Whether it's spirit photography, or whether it's materialization, or manipulating these energies that you're talking about.
But still, we have to.
Coming on the tape, the static on the tape.
Right, and pinch, cause needles to deflect.
Draw the wiggles on our spirit presence detector readout, all this stuff. They can do anything they want to, really. The spooks can do anything they want to. Just remember that.
He has a way of boiling it right down to some essential thing, you know.
I couldn't help but think when Sir Mark was delivering his learned lecture the other day on reincarnation. Now, Ben put the whole thing together some years ago for his audience in a little simple story about, I won't take time now, but involved the janitor and the big shot, the president of the corporation up on the 10th floor, and the chairman of the board who was up in the executive suite up on the 20th floor. And he just gave a perfect description of how the three levels of man work together, and totally different characteristics of the janitor down here. The president thought he was kind of a dumb cluck. He took care of the wastebasket and fixing the steam pipes when they leaked, but it turned out that the daughter of the janitor, living down there in a little cuddy room in the basement, married the chairman of the board. All the stuff that gets in it. It's just a marvelous little story. He's a great guy.
Okay, so that's Mark-1.
Well, Mark-2,
and you're talking about Mark-2
Mark-2, and the first two fairly successful experiments with Mark-2, our expectation was tremendous. When we started the session, you attended one of those, George, didn't you?
Yeah. Let me just, for my own purposes, check my memory on this. What specifically did you succeed in getting with Mark-2? You got a series of
well, we started out in getting simple pops and noises on there. Simple. We, of course, tried to eliminate any possible noises coming from the power supply. We were using a regulated, standard regulated power supply. So we convinced ourselves that the power supply was not causing.
So you went to battery and regulator.
So, yeah. Curiously enough, though, all our impingements were received with the original transistor series regulator, series voltage regulator. We had voltage, and this was quite a fairly good voltage and current regulated power supply with 4 power transistors in it. But all our impingements we received with this original power supply, which always left that little bit of doubt that the power supply may have contributed something to it. When we switched to NiCad batteries, the new hookup then was with the mistake, with having an increase, and we never did get any impingements after that. Of course, Swan says that they never attempted to impinge on it after that. So there is that little bit of doubt always. Was it really, Now I'm convinced myself that no noises of any kind that we recorded were caused by the power supply. I'm sure of that because I tested the power supply later on for quite a long time and during the time that we were using it. At any rate, we did receive irregular noises. Then they managed to, in a method that was described by Swan to us in one of the transcripts, he describes the method of the attempt of slowing down the spiritual elliptic energy in such a way that they were, as he described it, sending the energy down in a large figure eight, as though it was a skating alley, and they were sending the energy down in a figure eight swing and controlling the energy coming back and cutting through the carrier. Also, he didn't say that. The only explanation, according to Paul, that they must have cut the carrier with the energy which caused the sine waves, and they were, we determined, they were sine waves with a
I ran it on the recorder too.
Perfect start and no oscillation or tapering off, but they were able to control, to start and stop them almost perfectly.
I ran them on the strip recorder at one time, and they were right.
Now, we never did duplicate this with the NiCad silent power supply, which would have eliminated much of the noise that plagued us at the time. The only noise that we still had in there was the 60 and 120, I think it was 120, cycle from the power supply. Now, after switching to NiCad, which was then perfectly silent, it would have given us a much better chance to get the same effects then, to see to repeat what they had done, and then look at that signal on an oscilloscope.
Cerney? Yeah, okay.
Also, what I want to mention is that we have never listened to a report on our group at the time when we were working with them. Dr. Holmes was keeping the log, their own log, on all of their experiments that they tried. There exists a log of all their experiments which they had offered to read to us for our comparison and checking, which we never heard. So all of the experiments that were conducted during the nights that we had our Mark-2 set on automatic receive between the early morning hours, all of these experiments are logged. There is a log kept of that. Holmes kept that log. And Schwann offered it one time for us. If we were interested, he'd report to us about it.
Let's start the keeping of a list of any questions that occur to us, questions that we might be asking either tonight or tomorrow.
Right.
Is that a suitable question about the log?
I would think in the line of being really, we want to be. It always bugged me a little that we were really not quite sure of what we had accomplished and how far had we gone with it, and we never have double-checked it with them and their results. We kept a log merely of, I used to log in the modulations, if any, the days and the time that we had it on. But we were not present, George, during most of these experiments,
yes,
as you well aware.
I'll just start these down. I'll be the secretary for these questions. Anytime you have a question on that tonight, you state it.
Now, I brought
and
you
the first one I'm going to have Hans raise questions about the log. I don't need to put any more detail. That's just a reminder.
Right.
All right. So anytime you want a question.
Right. All right. Now to go back to these impingements, as they were irregular first and then became more regular. By that I mean we were able to view them on the scope. We determined they were sine wave impingements. We were fairly sure that they are the kind of modulation that you get by intersecting a high frequency carrier with a lower frequency. However, there was one problem. As recorded on audio tape, the repetition rate of these noises, which I can only describe as a muffled high-speed machine gun, like this.
But that was his signal that this was coming on. That it would start off with this.
Now, all of this makes me believe and think, and I'm fairly certain of this, that they do have a quite astonishing control over this type of energy. Quite astonishing control over that type of energy. Not only have they, in the frequency aspect, perfect control, in the pitch, in the modulation, in the speed in which they control it. They have absolute, varied, and total control over that energy. Because in the way he described it, tried to get us visualize what they are doing in trying to get across that carrier, in the way that they slow it down. And this has been my understanding all along, that their main problem at that time was slowing down their energy to the point where it would register in the audio. That was the problem.
In other words, the problem is you can think faster than you can talk.
Exactly.
I mean, if we think about
the entire was so fast that it all at once. It was interesting. I mentioned to George last night that when we stopped that, when we had gotten to that point, and we knew the problem was the repetition rate, and to slow it, that was always the admonition every time, every sitting, if you could slow it down a little. And we understood the problem was to slow it down. It now seems that now, theoretically and practically, we would have a means of capturing any kind of on or off pulsations with high-speed computer equipment. It would be no problem today to capture those. I mean, computers have been can capture these things up into the 10, 20 megahertz high speed.
I would think so.
My son-in-law has worked on a 50 megahertz computer for NASA and RCA, had it working, effectively working.
Yeah,
that's tremendous.
The biggest, slowest problem in computers today is the input-output.
The storage, fine, up to a point, but to unload the storage into a meaningful output, that is the problem.
Yeah.
In other words, if there were impingements with the binary code, if they could be stored, it could possibly also be worked out that the computer would see them as it's supposed to see them, without the noise and all the other things but then to empty the memory, to put the output onto a screen for visibility, or better still, on a 80 digit per line, 80 characters per line type out, high speed type out.
Right.
Now that's what I'm working with in my job. I work with computer type outs. I could even get one of those machines for nothing right there, and we set it up somewhere.
No, the problem is generally for a computer is to load it into the computer. In other words, what you probably end up having to do is record on a tape in 7.5.
Yeah, but we could record it on a tape because the audio frequencies would limit it.
Well,
it would have to be.
You put it on video recorder.
You would have to put it on a video recorder.
So you're up to what,
4 mega? Well, that's stretching the limit.
Yeah.
3, yeah. We would work with, even if we worked with 1 megahertz, even if we worked with 100,000 cycle repetition rate, that's inaudible. We wouldn't even hear that. That might make it easier. So these are my thoughts on what we had accomplished and what we could have gone from when we left off with our experiments. We never did pursue what we were just now talking about.
This ended up basically. You ended up then what, about 1974, 75.
5, yeah.
5.
Okay.
Now maybe this question should come later, but I'll bring it in here. You're talking about these energies, which you felt that they were able to manipulate, and that they demonstrated to you in various ways.
Exactly, yeah.
Is it possible that they could use those one or more of those same energies to manipulate light via some phase of a piece of laser equipment working in the ultraviolet? Can you visualize how whatever energies they were using could be used?
I could visualize that, yes.
Yeah, I could too.
All indications, George, seem to be that this particular energy is of extremely high frequency. The problem has always been in the slowing down of the energy to interact with whatever we could offer them. That has always been the problem. So it stands to reason, it would seem to make sense that the higher a carrier or frequency or oscillators or whatever could would be there as a means of interaction, why the better. That's what were our thoughts at 1975-76 when we decided, well, we might ultimately wind up in the light experiments in the light region and possibly even ultraviolet. We had gotten to that point. Also, it's the power of seems to be quite important too. It does make it easier if the radiated power is large enough for them to work with it. I mean, we thought definitely it's no use to take just any small oscillator and with a microwatts output and try to provide it. It's no sense. And nothing can be accomplished.
I'm not familiar with the relative power output of the laser approach. Is that
well, it's peak power. It's like in watts.
It's much higher.
Some lasers are available that have tremendous power outputs, enough to be absolutely dangerous to work with them. The particular one I mentioned to you, and the data you got on it, happens to be in the micro. It doesn't even have 1 watt of output. However, it is in the ultraviolet, and that is a rarity. You don't find many lasers in the ultraviolet region. This works in the lower ultraviolet. And you will notice that any laser output increases proportionately as you lower the frequency. If a laser can be made to work in 2 frequencies, the lower frequency will automatically increase the power output in square. It'll have that much more power.
Let's see, is Unger's working in just regular?
I have the data on all of that here, George.
No.
He doesn't have enough
I'm talking about Unger now. Just a minute. There's something pops into my mind right now that relates to what Unger and his buddy are doing.
Here's a very interesting little.
Yeah, this is electronic.
That's the electronic object. You may be familiar with that.
Yeah.
Yes, here's a letter from January 3rd from 6th from Unger, February 6th from Unger. Let's see. First part relates to something a little bit. I'll look into it here. I'll just read this. I've got a copy for each of you fellas to take along with you. But confidential. We are working on a laser, however, very slowly, as we discovered that not Cobra's engineer is the right man, but Gluckenbale, who, however, has very little time due to professional and similar reasons, so that we can only work when he can. But with some progress. I would like to work faster, but the safety reasons, and due to the after effect of a frustration, and for greater stimulation, it is better to work together with Gluckenbale, who thinks with me and brings forth his own ideas and tries to grasp the problem so that the work is not too difficult. Unfortunately, this is not the case with Cobra, which I regret very much, but I must think rationally, and therefore, for the slow tempo, we have some equalizer circuits here, but we could duplicate, that is, take out and duplicate. We shall try to, if on hand, send a Platin, P-L-A-T-I-N, layout later, and hope the copy will be clear enough so that you can rebuild it easier. You write that the tape recorder noise could be reduced. I believe that the background noise is a result of either an interference of the 3 pure tones or originates from the other side, parenthesis, transmission of the higher oscillation levels to the lower oscillation levels, in parentheses. I agree with you saying that one white crow proves that not all crows are black, and also with your thoughts about the various astral levels. Oh, wait, that's down here. He goes to Kirlian and then he comes back. I believe that laser is the closer connecting link due to the following. Very high frequency in the light field, monochromatic light, therefore a phase deviation with the polarized filters is possible. If one produces a tone mixture with 6 lasers, 3 pairs, 128, 256, and 512 cycles, then the tones must be pure enough to allow a good phase deviation, and the laser beam would have a higher energy potential.
That's a very interesting way of modulating with coherent phasor frequencies.
We are already anticipating your visit here in March. Hope to see you in good health, and also hope that all your arrangements for your trip to Red China are progressing according to your wishes. But I thought that, well, I don't know much about it. It seemed to me that sounded interesting there.
It is certainly very interesting.
He's picking up the idea from Doc Meek, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yes, but moving on up
into the higher frequencies. He's doing exactly what we're doing with audio oscillators, to duplicate that with laser.
Yeah.
Lasers oscillating and beating against each other. Very interesting.
And then we're up to a point where we're...
And that's about as high as you can carry it.
Yeah, where we're using the energies from the levels that we want to talk to. Versus the Doc Nick levels going in here on this.
We don't... Now let's review something. We don't know what Theodore Rudolph exactly has up his sleeves in his little MIZ box that he is... that seems to be the heart and the core of his apparatus and his setup.
We know one thing. What he is trying to do, or the term that I best know, it sounds like he's trying to build a circulator, where what he wants to do is shoot a laser beam in and either have the photons or the electrons or whatever is going through there gyrate to a point where they are producing 6 Gs or whatever acceleration to represent 6 Gs. And in that, then they can vary the
gravitons.
Gravitons. He produces gravitons, and they'll modulate the gravitons, which, when they come back into photons, will be having intelligence on it.
Because the gravitons are modulated.
Right.
On the basis of his theory that it is via gravity the answer can be had.
Yeah, that they can modulate gravity.
Yeah. Now, you are aware of the gentleman that accomplished producing gravitons with similar experiments in, was it General Electric or out in the West Coast in Berkeley somewhere? It appeared in the press several years ago. He is aware of that too. They have actually produced gravitons in a laboratory experiments. It isn't that he's out on a limb there. He's trying to take it a step further. But I'm still not sure, though, the modulation, just in which way he would...
Well, he doesn't know himself, or at least he told me when we were over there a year ago in November, was...
Did you see his apparatus?
No, because he hadn't built that part.
Did you see anything he had built?
Yeah, he showed us the
board,
and he had the...
I understand his workmanship is quite... he's an excellent...
Oh, yeah.
His craftsmanship is first class.
Yeah. Well, even Unger's...
Well, Unger was doing the work for him, you see. That's the one they split off. They had this personality clash.
Yeah, you got a little problem.
So a man who knows what... A technician built the equipment.
Right.
Oh, yes, superb. And now we've got that talent. And Unger, he's continuing, you see, and doing the work.
Unger had his partially built. And it's just like it was like a production unit. You wouldn't know.
I was amazed by what I saw from the pictures you took about the quality of his equipment.
Yeah. Who?
Unger's.
You took pictures of Rudolf Theodore's equipment, his power supplies and things.
But the thing is, I think this is one of the. Of course, I realize with optics, the precision, the mechanical precision.
You realize, and when you work with optics, you start out with a heavy. Steel, perfectly perfect things.
Right.
Your entire.
Yeah, it's a whole different thing. I realize that. Now, the interesting thing with optics is that you can go into a splitter and run 2 parallel lines and have no interference.
Right.
It's not like a stereo where you got crossed off and everything, and then come back through a mixer, and even if you can adjust the
alignments
phase,
and all is perfect, you
can bring them right back in and either add or subtract.
Now I'm still thinking about the fact to combine 2 or 3 laser beams.
Yeah, that's exciting. See.
Now that is quite. How to accomplish that in a control you could have. You realize the accuracy the control you could have over those modulations.
I never really thought
with the micrometer adjustments that some of these things offer and all of the.
Well, what if you took a ruby and you took a CO2 laser, different ones, and
Yeah, but they have to be close together, see, because there are tremendous gaps in frequency between a ruby and an ultraviolet.
Yeah.
You're gapping, God, how many, So you'd have to
but can
have.
you produce a new kind of? Can you produce a third light out of it? In other words, you take two monochromatics and mix them in a crystal. Can you produce a third light like you do with two carriers?
Why can't the two beams be combined through splitting and techniques, and they would very much react like any two frequencies of light.
Just to give you a little introduction to Unger. Here is Norbert Unger, Gertrude Beyer, our translator. This couple have a hairdressing salon. They built a house, a nice house, where they have their hairdressing on the first floor, and then they live on the next floor. And in the basement, because of their interest in parapsychology, their friendship with him, they've made a basement room available for a laboratory, which Unger is using for parapsychology.
Right.
And he is working on this bench and back on down here on the laser equipment. This guy was working on Kirlian photography experiments along this wall over here, which you can't see. He was fooling around a little bit with pyramids. He's not a technical man at all, but he was having some fun out of it. And
he makes a good subject because he's very much interested in.
Yeah, and this little girl is an interesting person. And we'll show you when you go into photography later. We'll show you some most unusual photographs that occurred in the presence of this little girl and her mother. I think she's somewhat psychic also.
Sounds like
she's a little sweetheart here. But this is Unger. He's a small man. He's about the height of Bill O'Neill, maybe just a little bit heavier through here. But he and Rudolph were miles apart. He's an organization man. Rudolph, I'm sure, never was. Rudolph has some of the same traits as Bill O'Neill, and it's easy to see why they got apart. Rudolph accuses him of a lot of things that may or may not be true. I'll say at this point, I give Unger the benefit of the doubt on the things. Rudolph thought that this guy was stealing some of Rudolph's ideas. Well, he had no reason to steal them. They were working together. He didn't want to go off on his own whatsoever.
Well, that's the problem when you have people working together like this. You have to. Let me just. My own experience, the going with Paul when I worked together with him was not always easy. I had times where I was ready to just about say, Paul, I can't take it anymore. Yeah. Because he was treating me like Bill has been treated up to now by Muller. Yeah. And I kept telling myself, well, swallow. The thing is more important. The overall, what we're trying to accomplish is more important than than personalities, because we all have different personalities and we don't always go along. We clash sometimes, but you have to suppress that because it's much more important to keep on. So we had fairly decent.
In getting back to your question. All right, here's the helium neon is 150 milliwatts. The carbon dioxide is 60 kilowatts.
Imagine the
60 kW.
Incredible.
And there's argon, which gets down into UV, a high end of UV, is 10 watts continuous. These are continuous now. Mm-hmm. Then if you get down into the there's a 50 milliwatt continuous. If you get into the pulsed, 10 to the 9th watts. That's 1,000 kilowatts. No, that's 1,000 megawatts of power that is possible. And so on down the line. They've got 24 watts pulsed or 100 milliwatts continuous. This gallium arsenide, that's infrared.
So one of the questions that still remains open, talking about this energy, the ones we've been discussing for the last half an hour, I don't know whether we ever got a confirmation from them or whether we ever asked that question, just how high an energy it is, that is in frequency, how much control over the energy there is. Well, we did get a partial answer on that. There is a tremendous amount of control on that. And whether it would, and we did also, I think, I'm sorry, I take that back, we did get an answer on whether it would be better to work at a higher frequency on our part. Yes, that was confirmed also, that would be better.
One of the things that we can look at, we can assume that if this energy that is passed on is the same energy that's within our body now, and we see the people who use PK psychokinesis,
Is that might well be the energy that is
and
being
if
used.
they are able to roll a pin, and this takes a certain amount of wattage, we could figure out the energy required.
I've seen these experiments.
This would give us a clue of what kind of energies they could develop. They should be able to do it better because they should be more efficient in trying to pull some of it out of us to move it.
Should we have a question
Now whether, yes.
later on? These questions aren't being put down in any sequence at all. But should we have a question that we throw at them on Unger's concept of the 3 pairs of lasers?
That certainly is a very interesting thing. Our original idea about applying laser was to establish a reference with a laser beam in the low ultraviolet region.
Right.
Is to take a film, make a record of this, very much like in a holography.
Yeah.
See? And then have this film, the reference that we established and the image we have on the film, is to have any variation from that, ever so slightly, and it would allow a great accuracy. Any impingement or anything they would do that would alter that is to measure that or to display that with what we have as a reference. In other words, any impingement on the beam, we never thought about possibly having 2 or 3 beams mixing or modulating together. That certainly is an interesting thing. Also would be possibly fairly expensive. Well, we don't know. But lasers, by the way, have come down. They really there's a lot of equipment on the market now.
He's building all of his own equipment there, the glass work for the water cooling.
Can you imagine the thing he's laboring under to build all of this? I'll have to do that on.
Let me just go back over that. I want to refresh my own memory. I believe that the laser is the closer connecting link due to the following: very high frequency in the light field, monochromatic light, therefore a phase deviation with polarized filters is possible. One produces a tone mixture with 6 lasers, 3 pairs, 128, 256, 512 cycles. Then the tones must be pure enough to allow a good phase deviation, and the laser beam would have higher energy potential. It seems that all of those relate pretty specifically.
Oh, what he's suggesting is to modulate the lasers with the audio oscillator energy that...
Well, I don't know if he's saying that or whether he should zero beat them close enough that they could produce.
Repeat
in other words, with a
if one
phase,
produces a tone mixture with 6 lasers, then the tones must be pure enough to allow a good phase deviation, and the laser beam would have a higher energy potential.
Yeah, but going back,
That's it.
Yeah,
I
in
believe
other
the
words-
laser is a closer connecting link due to the following: very high frequencies in the light field, monochromatic light.
Right.
Therefore, a phase deviation with polarized filters.
is possible. So you take 2 of these that are identical, and you use a polarized filter, and you get a phase shift, so that, and you shift it mechanically enough that you can produce a 200 or 128 cycle difference.
I see, yeah.
And then he says you take all of these and you're mixing them in a hodgepodge, but now you got That's why he's saying 6 lasers. You need 2 to produce a difference of 128 cycles, 2 to produce 256, and 512. To come up with these, and I don't know how he's going to do this. I can see how you can phase shift one with the polarized filter. In other words, when you run through a polarized filter, you can delay it slightly, very, very slightly, and get a 0 beat or a difference frequency. But how do you get it all into one pile?
You have enough control in the polarization to actually change the frequency within the limits here.
Yeah. But he's saying taking 6 of them, beating 2 of them together, 2 of them together, and 2 of them to produce. Oh, okay. Then if they come in and modulate any one of these light frequencies, you would be able to get a change in the tone.
You can recover it as easily as you can on the tape recorder.
Right. Okay. But you're taking billions of cycles, and you're going to sort out and just come out with 256 cycles out of several billions. That gets pretty hairy.
If any equipment can do that, though, it would be the coherent beam of a laser.
Right. Well, particularly if you took, you got.
I think I've got 7 minutes yet.
Okay. Particularly if you ran it from a single source, ran through a beam splitter down a parallel, and then back into the phase, and then use a polarized chamber. See, we did this at Link Aviation in the early 50s for what they call a fringe count spectrometer. They put the krypton light, which was, I don't know what the angle is, but it's
it's very high.
Pretty high. They ran it down, they ran it through a beam splitter, and then they would let the head down, and they would count when it crossed every time they phased. It would give a little pulse, and they would count these little pulses.
Yeah.
And you can adjust it. Well, that was set where you can measure down to a millionth of an inch.
That's what some of these setups were used for, to highly accurate measurements.
Well, that's the way the Bureau of Standards does it. Only they do it mechanically. They count all the fringes as they go out to measure the yardstick. And what they've done is electronically adjusted this thing up and down. But the problems with it is fantastic. You've got to have it in an air-conditioned room and a constant humidity. And what they ended up doing is they had a 60-watt light bulb they'd turn on in the room when they left, and when they come back in, they turn it off because that was the amount of heat that the body generated in the room. It was really wild. Of course, that was back when nobody knew much about it.
Well, you were doing standardization. You were doing standards. You were working with standards.
Right.
You have to remember.
Oh, they were calibrating Joe blocks and stuff.
Wow, I mean, that's...
But anyway, also we were measuring long distances relatively, as opposed to, something you could do in a 6-inch span, which the distance would make a tremendous difference. Okay, that brings us up to Mark 2.
So one can say that maybe what we had been working with up to the end of Mark 2 in Philly was the energy, this particular energy, and that from then on we more or less got into the direct voice reconstruction and voice modulation. We shouldn't say voice modulation. What it is a reconstruction of the voice. They are reconstructing the voice.
Right.
Which brings me to a question, George. Now you say the two things that we know, the means of or senses, so to speak, is speaking and hearing.
Hold on. Wait just a second.